We think of ancient Egypt as eternal, a civilization of stone and gold that has defied the ages. The pyramids, the great temples, the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, they stand as defiant monuments against the erosion of time. But this is an illusion of history. For every monument that survived, a metropolis vanished. For every king remembered in stone, a thriving city was swallowed by the shifting desert sands or submerged beneath the waves of the sea. These are the stories we seek tonight, the whispers from Egypt's lost cities, places of immense power, and life that were erased from the map and forgotten by history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins not with a whisper, but with a shout, a declaration so loud it tore the fabric of Egyptian society, a theological rebellion orchestrated by a single visionary and perhaps delusional mind. To understand the lost city of Akhetaten, which we now call Amarna, we must first understand the man who dreamed it into existence, Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, who would later cast that name aside to become Akhenaten. For over 1,000 years before his reign, Egypt had been a land of many gods. A complex and beautiful pantheon governed every aspect of existence, from the rising of the sun with Ra to the judgment of the soul by Osiris in the underworld. The priests of these gods, particularly the powerful clergy of Amun-Ra at Thebes, wielded immense wealth and political influence, sometimes rivaling that of the pharaoh himself. Amenhotep IV ascended to this throne, into this world of entrenched tradition and distributed divine power. But he carried a dangerous idea, an idea that would have been considered blasphemy of the highest order. He believed in a single universal God, not a new god, but an elevation of a minor aspect of the sun god, the physical solar disk itself. The Aten dot in the early years of his reign, this was a subtle shift. He built a temple to the Aten at Karnak, the very heart of the Amun cult, a brazen, moved but not yet a full declaration of war, but the pressure from the old priesthood, the weight of a millennium of tradition, was suffocating. Akhenaten realized his revolution could not be born in a city that belonged to the old gods. His singular god needed a new home, a virgin space, untainted by the worship of others. He needed to build utopia from scratch. And so, in the 5th year of his reign, he embarked on a journey that would change the face of Egypt forever. He sailed up the Nile, searching for the perfect location. The legend, as he tells it on the boundary markers of his future city, is that the Aten itself guided his chariot. He was led to a vast, desolate bay in the cliffs of the eastern desert, a semicircular basin of sand and rock, untouched by previous settlement. Here, he declared, would be the new center of the universe. He would call it Akhetaten, the Aten of the Aten. This was not merely the construction of a new capital. It was an exodus. Akhenaten ordered the entire royal court, the administration of the empire, the architects, the artisans, the soldiers, and thousands upon thousands of laborers to abandon the ancient and glorious city of Thebes. Imagine the upheaval. Imagine being a stone carver whose family had worked in the shadows of Karnak for generations, now being told to pack your tools and your life and move to a barren patch of desert, hundreds of kilometers away. Imagine being a nobleman, your wealth, tied to estates near Thebes, now forced to build a new mansion in a place that was, for all intents and purposes, the middle of nowhere. The construction of Akhetaten was a miracle of logistics and sheer force of will. In an astonishingly short period, a city rose from the empty sands. It was unlike any Egyptian city before it. The traditional, winding, organic streets of Thebes were replaced by a more planned layout, with a great royal road running parallel to the Nile. This was the city's spine. Along it were built the grand structures of the new faith. The great Ain Temple was a marvel of revolutionary architecture. Unlike the dark, mysterious sanctuaries of the old gods, this temple was open to the sky. A series of vast, unroofed courtyards were filled with thousands of offering tables, allowing the sun's rays, the physical manifestation of the Aten, to pour in unimpeded. There was no shadowy cult statue to hide in a holy of holies. The god was visible to all every day in the sky above. Palaces were built, administrative buildings, sprawling villas for the high officials like the Vizier Nakht and the General Ramos. These villas themselves tell the story of life in this strange new world. Excavations have revealed them to be luxurious compounds with gardens, pools, and decorated halls. But uniquely, each one had a private chapel, not to the household gods of old, but to the royal family. Because in Akhenaten's new theology, he and his queen, the beautiful Nefertiti, were the sole intermediaries between humanity and the Aten. To worship the god, you had to worship the pharaoh. The art that filled these homes was equally revolutionary. The stiff, formal, idealized forms of traditional Egyptian art were shattered. In their place came a new, almost disturbingly naturalistic style. The royal family was depicted not as divine automatons, but as a living, breathing family. We see Akhenaten with his distinctive elongated skull and pendulous belly, Nefertiti in stunning portraits of regal beauty, and both of them playing with their young daughters, bathing them in the life-giving rays of the Aten, its arms ending, and little hands that offer the yank, the symbol of life. But this is the story of the 1%. What of the untold story? What of the 99% who built this city and lived in its shadow? Archaeologists have excavated the workers' village at Amarna, a planned settlement of simple, uniform houses laid out on a grid. And they have studied the cemeteries where these people were buried. The story these bones tell is a brutal one. The skeletons of the common people of Akhetaten show evidence of extreme hardship. They suffered from high rates of malnutrition, anemia, and spinal injuries from back-breaking labor. The average age of death was shockingly low, even for the shock and for the ancient world. They were building a horizon of light, but they were living in darkness and dying in droves. Their diet, restricted by the desert location and the complex logistics of supplying a massive city, was poor. They were the disposable workforce for a king's divine experiment. They were building a utopia on a foundation of their own suffering. Life in the city, even for the elite, must have been psychologically jarring. Every facet of their existence, every prayer, every festival, every piece of art they saw, was a constant reinforcement of Akhenaten's new reality. The old gods were outlawed. Their names were systematically chiseled out of monuments across Egypt in a state-sponsored campaign of iconoclasm. This wasn't just forgetting. It was an active, violent erasure of thousands of years of culture. Imagine the fear and confusion. Imagine the secret prayers whispered to Osiris or Isis in the privacy of one's home, hoping the neighbors wouldn't. Here, for about 17 years, this strange, intense, sun-drenched city was the center of the Egyptian empire. From here, Akhenaten engaged in diplomacy, as evidenced by the famous Amarna letters, a cache of clay tablets that reveal a king so focused on his religious revolution that he seemed to neglect the growing threats to his empire abroad. Vassal kings in Syria and Palestine begged for troops and support against encroaching enemies, and their pleas, it seems, were largely ignored. The pharaoh was busy composing hymns to the sun, and then, as quickly as it began, it ended. Akhenaten died. The exact circumstances are unknown. Was he assassinated? Did he succumb to illness? We may never know for sure. His immediate successors, the ephemeral Smenkher and the young Tutankhamun, couldn't sustain the revolution. The pull of tradition, the power of the disenfranchised priesthood of Amun, and the sheer economic and social exhaustion of the Egyptian people were too great. Tutankhamun, born Tutankhaten, changed his name, abandoned Akhenaten, and moved the court back to Thebes. He issued a decree, the Restoration Stela, which described the Amarna period as a time when the temples of the gods and goddesses had gone to ruin, and the land was in sickness. It was a complete and total rejection of everything his father had stood for. This is when Akhenaten became a true ghost city. The order was given to abandon it. The population, likely with a sense of profound relief, packed up and left. The desert began its slow process of reclamation, but it wasn't enough to simply let the city be forgotten. It had to be destroyed. The pharaohs who followed, particularly Horemheb and the kings of the 19th dynasty, like Ramesses the Great, initiated a campaign of damnatio memoria, the damnation of memory, against Akhenaten. They referred to him only as that criminal, or the enemy of Akhenaten. His name was scraped from king lists. His statues were smashed, and his city, his beautiful horizon of the Ating, became a quarry. Its finely cut stone blocks, known as Talatat, were dismantled and ferried away to be used as filler for new temple pylons at Karnak and Hermopolis. They were literally burying the heresy inside the temples of the old gods. For 3,000 years, Akhenaten was lost. Its location was known, but its story was buried, its king damned and forgotten. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that archaeologists began to systematically unearth its secrets, piecing together the story of this incredible, short-lived city from the foundations of its palaces, the graves of its workers, and the beautiful, haunting art that its creators left behind. The untold story of Amarna is one of dazzling, fanatical vision, built on a bedrock of human suffering. It is a testament to the power of a single idea to create a world, and a reminder of how quickly that world can be unmade, dismantled, and buried by the sands of history, leaving behind only ghosts and a cautionary tale about the high cost of utopia. From a city deliberately erased by the hand of man, we now journey to one that was claimed by the inexorable power of nature itself. We leave the dry heat of the desert behind and travel north to the coast, where the great Nile River, after its epic journey through Africa, finally surrenders itself to the Mediterranean Sea. For millennia, this coastline was a place of exchange, a threshold between Egypt and the wider world. It was a landscape of marshy wetlands, shifting sandbars, and the branching arms of the Nile Delta. And for centuries, the most important of these arms, the Canopic branch, flowed past a city that was for a long time the magnificent gateway to Egypt. This city was known to the Greeks as Heracleion. To the Egyptians, it was Thonis. For thousands of years, scholars believed them to be two separate places, their stories intertwined but their locations distinct. Herodotus, the great Greek historian, wrote of Heracleion in the 5th century BC, describing it as the port where Helen of Troy and her lover Paris first landed in Egypt before the Trojan War. He spoke of a great temple there, built in honor of Heracles, the Greek hero. Later texts mentioned it as a vital port of entry, a place of immense wealth and religious significance. And then, after the 8th century A.D., the historical record falls silent. The river's course shifted. The coastline was remodeled by earthquakes and floods, and the city, once so crucial, vanished. It was not just abandoned and left to crumble. It disappeared so completely that it was relegated to the realm of myth, a half-forgotten legend that the search for this phantom city was one of the great quests of modern marine archaeology. For years, teams scanned the murky waters of Aboukir Bay, east of Alexandria. The seabed here is not a clear, sandy bottom. It is a world of thick silt and mud, carried by the Nile for eons, a dark blanket that shrouds everything it touches. Finding a coin here is a challenge. Finding a lost city is a near impossibility. But in the late 1990s, a team led by the French underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio began a systematic survey. Using advanced equipment side-scan sonar, nuclear magnetic resonance magnetometers, they weren't looking for objects. They were looking for anomalies, for disturbances in the magnetic field of the seafloor, for ghostly shapes in the digital darkness. In the year 2000, after years of patient, methodical searching, they found it. 6 kilometers off the modern coastline, buried under meters of sand and silt, the first definitive proof emerged. A diver fanning away the sediment in the cold, dark water uncovered a colossal stone head. It was a depiction of a pharaoh, its eyes staring blankly into the gloom of the abyss. Soon more discoveries followed. Statues of goddesses, sphinxes, and a towering 5-meter-tall representation of Hapi, the androgynous god of the Nile's flood. They had found something monumental, but was it Heracleion, or was it Thonis? The final, undeniable proof came in the form of a magnificent black grenadierite stele, a stone slab covered in hieroglyphs, perfectly preserved by its muddy tomb. It was a decree issued by Pharaoh Nekhen in the 4th century BC. It declared that a 10% tax on all goods imported from the Sea of the Greeks through the town of Thonis was to be collected and donated to the temple of Amun-Gareb, the city's primary deity. And crucially, it was a near-identical twin to another stele, found decades earlier on land, which was written in Greek and referred to the city as Heracleion. The puzzle was solved. Thonis and Heracleion were one and the same. The Egyptians called it Thonis. The Greeks who came to trade there called it Heracleion, likely because they syncretized the chief Egyptian god of the city with their own hero, Heracles. The lost city had a name again, or rather two. With this key, a new chapter of Egyptian history began to be written, pulled piece by piece from the silent, silty seabed. And the story it tells is not just of a cataclysmic end, but of a vibrant, cosmopolitan life as the very heart of international commerce for the later pharaonic dynasties. Let's close our eyes and try to imagine this place, not as a silent ruin in the deep, but as it was in its prime around the 6th century BC. Imagine you are a Greek merchant, having spent weeks at sea, your ship laden with silver, olive oil, and fine wines from the Aegean. Your first sight of Egypt would be the lighthouse at the mouth of the Canopic Nile, guiding you towards the bustling port. The city of Thonis-Heracleion was not built on solid ground, but on a collection of sand and mud islands crisscrossed by a network of canals. It would have been an Egyptian Venice, a city of water, with houses, temples, and warehouses seemingly floating between the channels. Your ship would not simply dock at a pier. It would be guided into a sacred basin, surrounded by the towering walls of the great temple of Amun-Gareb. This was not just a commercial port. It was a religious checkpoint. Entry into Egypt was a sacred transition, and it had to be officiated by the gods. Officials and priests would board your vessel. They were the customs agents of the ancient world. Your cargo would be meticulously inspected and recorded on papyrus scrolls. The tax, the dikate as decreed on the Nekhen apostille, would be levied. This was the economic lifeblood of the city. Thonis-Heracleion held a monopoly on all maritime trade coming into the kingdom. Every amphora of wine, every ingot of metal, every piece of foreign pottery had to pass through its canals and contribute to its treasury. The wealth generated here was immense, funding the pharaohs and the powerful temples. The artifacts recovered from the site tell the story with beautiful clarity. Hundreds of ancient anchors, lead weights for measuring goods, and a fortune in gold coins and jewelry from across the ancient world. Life within the city would have been a dizzying blend of cultures. In the canals you would see the sleek, high-prowed Greek trading ships moored alongside traditional Egyptian papyrus barges. The air would be thick with a dozen languages. Egyptian priests chanting hymns, Greek sailors shouting orders, Phoenician merchants haggling over prices, and Aramaic-speaking dignitaries conducting state business. The markets would be a riot of color and scent, selling local grain, papyrus, and linen alongside imported Greek pottery and exotic goods from further east. It was a true melting pot, a place where different worlds collided and mingled, creating a unique hybrid culture. The art reflects this, with statues carved in a traditional, stiff Egyptian style found alongside artifacts showing a clear Hellenic influence. The religious life of the city was just as important as its commercial life. Its central feature was the magnificent temple to Amun-Gareb, a local form of the king of the gods. But it was also a key site for the worship of Osiris, the god of the afterlife and resurrection. Each year, one of the most important festivals in the Egyptian calendar took place here, the Mysteries of Osiris. The god's ceremonial barge would begin a grand procession from the temple in Thonis-Heracleion, sailing through the canals to the neighboring town of Canopus. It would have been a spectacular sight, with thousands of pilgrims lining the banks, chanting, singing, and lighting lamps to celebrate the god's eternal cycle of death and rebirth. Archaeologists have found dozens of small lead barges in the bay, likely votive offerings left by the faithful to commemorate this sacred journey. They are the ghostly echoes of a profound public faith. The city was dominated by its colossal stone monuments. Imagine sailing through its main channel and looking up to see immense, 5-meter-tall statues of a pharaoh and a queen flanking the entrance to the main temple. Imagine seeing the serene, powerful face of the flood god Hapi, a symbol of the abundance the Nile provided, towering over the waterways. These were not just decorations. They were projections of divine and royal power, reminding all who entered that they were now in the sacred realm of the pharaoh, under the protection of Egypt's mighty gods. For centuries, this city stood as a symbol of Egypt's enduring power, its wealth, and its divine order. But it was built on a treacherous foundation. The entire Nile Delta is, by its nature, geologically unstable. It is composed of immense layers of soft clay and silt deposited over millennia. Thonis-Heracleion, built upon these waterlogged sediments, was particularly vulnerable, and the very things that proclaimed its power, the massive stone temples and the colossal statues weighing many tons, were also its fatal weakness. Sometime around the 2nd century BC, the first signs of trouble appeared. A major earthquake, a common occurrence in the eastern Mediterranean, likely struck the region. The immense shock waves traveling through the unstable, water-saturated ground would have caused a terrifying phenomenon known as soil liquefaction. The vibrations would have transformed the solid ground into a liquid-like slurry. The foundations of the heaviest buildings, particularly the Great Temple, would have lost all support. The massive stone walls and columns, the colossi of kings and gods, would have tilted, collapsed, and then sunk whole into the now fluid earth. The divers who first explored the site described seeing entire temple walls lying flat on the seabed, as if they had simply tipped over and been swallowed by the ground. The city didn't just crumble. It sank into the mud. This was likely not a single instantaneous event, but the beginning of a slow, inexorable death. The initial catastrophe probably destroyed the city's main temple complex and caused widespread damage. Some residents may have rebuilt, trying to cling to their homes, but the land was now irrevocably weakened. Over the next few centuries, a gradual process of subsidence, a slow sinking of the entire landmass, continued. Rising sea levels would have compounded the problem, with the Mediterranean slowly encroaching on what was left of the city. Smaller earthquakes and Nile floods would have hastened the decline. The city that was once Egypt's vibrant gateway slowly became a waterlogged, sinking marsh, a ghost of its former self. The final, fatal blow likely came in the 8th century A.D. Another major flood or earthquake appears to have wiped the last vestiges of Thonis-Heracleion from the map, submerging it completely and covering it with a final, thick layer of sand and silt that would hide it from human eyes for the next 1,200 years. The canopic branch of the Nile, the city's very reason for being, eventually silted up and changed its course, and the center of commerce moved to the new port of Alexandria, founded by the Greeks who had once been Thonis-Heracleion's primary customers. History moved on, and the memory of the sunken city faded into legend, a footnote in the writings of an ancient historian. The rediscovery of Thonis-Heracleion is more than just a remarkable feat of archaeology. It is the recovery of a lost world. Each artifact brought to the surface, from the grandest colossus to the humblest fish plate, is a piece of a forgotten story. It reminds us that ancient Egypt was not an isolated, inward-looking civilization, but a dynamic and deeply connected player in the ancient world. It shows us how religious belief, economic power, and civic life were inextricably linked. But, most profoundly, the story of this sunken port is a humbling testament to the fragility of human ambition in the face of the raw, indifferent power of the natural world. A city that commanded the trade of nations, built to honor the eternal gods, was ultimately reclaimed by the earth and the sea, its grand monuments sleeping in the dark until we came looking for them. It is a ghost story whose specters are carved from stone, a mystery whose clues are written in gold, and a cautionary tale of a metropolis built on shifting ground. History, as we often think of it, is a linear story. A city is founded, it grows, it flourishes, and perhaps it falls. But the story of our next lost city defies this simple progression. It is a tale not of creation, but of assembly. A story of political cunning so audacious that it involved physically moving the past to create the present. This is the story of Tanis, a city that for decades was mistaken for something else entirely, a grand illusion that succeeded so perfectly. It fooled historians for 3,000 years not to understand the birth of Tanis. We must travel to a time of fracture and uncertainty in Egypt, the dawn of the Third Intermediate Period. Around 1070 BC, the glorious New Kingdom, the age of warrior pharaohs like Thutmose III and the great builder Ramesses II, was over. The centralized power that had held the empire together had crumbled. Egypt was now a divided land. In the south, the traditional religious capital of Thebes was controlled by the powerful high priests of Amun, who ruled Upper Egypt as a virtual theocracy. In the north, a new line of kings, the 21st dynasty, ruled from the Nile Delta. These were the pharaohs of a diminished kingdom, lacking the absolute authority and vast resources of their ancestors. These northern kings faced a profound crisis of legitimacy. How could they project the divine power and eternal stability of the pharaonic office when their authority was so clearly compromised? They needed a capital city, a northern rival to Thebes, a grand stage upon which to perform their kingship. But building a new metropolis on the scale of Thebes or the legendary cities of the past was beyond their means. The quarries were distant, the labor force was not what it once was, and the treasury was thin. Their solution was one of brilliant, almost cynical pragmatism. If you cannot build a new glorious past, you must borrow one, about 30 kilometers. To the southeast of their chosen site for Tanis lay another city, a place we will explore more deeply in our next chapter. This was Pi-Ramesses, the magnificent northern capital, built by Ramesses the Great himself. For over a century, it had been the jewel of the empire, a sprawling metropolis of palaces, temples, and barracks. But Pi-Ramesses had a fatal flaw. It was built on the Pelusiac branch of the Nile, and that branch was silting up. The river, the lifeblood of any Egyptian city, was abandoning it. Its harbor was becoming unusable, its agricultural lands were drying up, and the great city of Ramesses was slowly dying, becoming a ghost town of monumental but useless splendor. For the kings of the 21st dynasty, this was not a tragedy. It was an opportunity, a divine quarry already cut, carved, and imbued with the majesty of Egypt's greatest pharaoh. And so began one of the most astonishing recycling projects in human history. King Suzens I, the new dynasty's greatest builder, initiated the systematic deconstruction of Pi-Ramesses in order to construct Tanis. This was not a simple plundering for building materials. It was a careful, deliberate, and wholesale relocation. Imagine the scene. Gangs of workmen swarmed over the silent temples and palaces of Pi-Ramesses. They carefully dismantled colossal statues of Ramesses II, some weighing hundreds of tons. They dug out sphinx, many of which were even older, dating back to the Middle Kingdom and usurped by Ramesses for his own city. They leveraged towering granite obelisks from their bases, each one a single, perfect shaft of stone covered in hymns to Ramesses' glory. Even the very walls of the temples, built from massive blocks of stone, were taken apart piece by piece. These monumental remains were then dragged onto barges and floated through the labyrinthine canals of the Nile Delta to their new home at Tanis. There they were re-erected. An obelisk carved for Ramesses II was now placed before the entrance to a new, smaller temple built by Suzens I, a pair of sphinx from the Middle Kingdom that had once guarded a palace in Pi-Ramesses now flanked a processional way in Tanis. The city rose from the delta soil not as a new creation, but as a collage of a greater, grander past. To any visitor, the effect would have been seamless and awe-inspiring. They would walk through avenues lined with statues of Ramesses the Great, read his name on the towering obelisks, and enter temples that seemed to have stood for centuries. The message was clear and powerful. The kings of Tanis were the direct and rightful successors to the great Ramesses. They literally lived in his house. It was a masterful act of political propaganda, a history rewritten not in papyrus, but in granite and gold. For centuries, this city served its purpose as the northern capital. But the kings of Tanis knew that their grip on power was precarious. They could not even guarantee themselves a traditional burial in the hallowed ground of the Valley of the Kings near Thebes, which was firmly in the hands of their southern rivals. They needed a new, secure place for their journey into the afterlife. Their solution was as radical as the construction of their city, breaking with centuries of tradition that separated the city of the living from the city of the dead. They built their tombs within the sacred precinct of their main temple, the temple of Amun at Tanis. They hoped to find safety by burying themselves under the very nose of the god Dot, and for 3,000 years it worked. The tombs were never found by robbers. It wasn't until 1939 that a French archaeologist, Pierre Montet, excavating within the temple walls, stumbled upon a hidden necropolis. What he found was breathtaking. He had discovered the intact royal tombs of the kings of Tanis. The timing of the discovery was unfortunate. As the world plunged into the Second World War, the spectacular finds were largely overshadowed. But their importance is immense. Montet uncovered the tomb of Pharaoh Suzens I, who was buried in a magnificent, gleaming sarcophagus made not of gold, but of solid silver. In the ancient world, silver was often rarer and more prized than gold, making this a burial of unimaginable prestige. Upon the pharaoh's face was a stunning golden funeral mask, second only to Tutankhamun's in its fame. The other tombs yielded similar treasures: jewel-encrusted pectorals, golden sandals, and lapis lazuli inlays. But they also held a final, telling secret. Much of the funerary equipment, the canopic jars and sarcophagi, was also second-hand. They had found objects originally made for earlier pharaohs like Merinta, Ramesses II's son, repurposed for the burials of the Tanite kings. Their grand project of borrowing from the past extended even to the grave. They ruled in a borrowed city, and they went to the afterlife in borrowed finery. The genius of their illusion, however, had one final act to play. When Montet and the first generations of archaeologists began to explore Tanis, they found hundreds of monuments, statues, and inscriptions bearing the name of Ramesses the Great. The conclusion seemed obvious. They believed they had discovered the legendary lost city of Pi-Ramesses. For decades, maps were drawn, and history books were written with this fact set in stone. The propaganda of the 21st dynasty had worked perfectly. It wasn't until the 1960s that the truth began to emerge. Archaeologists noticed discrepancies. The geography of the site didn't quite match ancient descriptions of Pi-Ramesses. Another archaeologist, Manfred Bietig, began excavating at a different site, Kantir, the place from which the monuments had been taken. There he found the foundations of the missing buildings. He found the immense palace of Ramesses II, the military garrisons, the industrial areas, but the monumental stone decorations were all gone. The puzzle pieces finally clicked into place. Kantir was the true Pi-Ramesses, the city of Ramesses the Great. Tanis was the meticulously assembled copy, the grand illusion. The story of Tanis is therefore the story of a ghost and its reflection. It is a city that teaches us that history is not just what happened, but what later generations want you to think happened. It reveals a period of Egyptian history not defined by brute strength, but by cleverness and political theater. The kings of Tanis were master illusionists who, faced with a crisis of legitimacy, built a stage set of such magnificent proportions that it became real in its own right, a borrowed city that held the power of a kingdom and kept its secrets for millennia. We have just walked the avenues of a city built of reflections, a capital assembled from the ghosts of a greater past. Tanis was a masterpiece of political stagecraft, a city that wore the identity of another like a stolen royal robe. But every reflection has a source. Every echo has an original voice. We must now journey back 2 centuries before the founding of Tanis, to the apex of the new kingdom, and find that source. We are searching for the true legendary capital of Ramesses II, a city of such splendor that its memory endured, even after every one of its monumental stones had been carried away. This is the story of a city that didn't just fall into ruin, but vanished almost entirely, choked to death by the very land that gave it life. The great metropolis of Pi-Ramesses. Anaktu, the domain of Ramesses, great in victory. To understand Pi-Ramesses, we must understand its creator, the man who was arguably the most prolific builder, propagandist, and self-promoter in the history of the world. Pharaoh Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great. His 90-year lifespan was an age unto itself. He ruled for an astonishing 67 years, serving over 100 children and covering the land of Egypt from Nubia to the Delta with temples, monuments, and colossal statues of himself. His name is carved on more ancient stones than that of any other pharaoh. If Egyptian kingship was a performance, Ramesses II was its greatest showman. For centuries, the twin centers of Egyptian power had been Memphis in the north, the old administrative capital, and Thebes in the south, the religious heartland of the god Amun-Ra. But Ramesses was a man with new ambitions and new problems. He came from a family of soldiers who had originated in the eastern Nile Delta. His primary foreign policy concern was not south in Nubia, but northeast in the Levant. He fought titanic battles against the Hittite Empire in Syria, culminating in the famous Battle of Kadesh. To manage these vast military campaigns, to muster, train, and supply an army of tens of thousands of chariots and infantrymen, he needed a base of operations in the north, a strategic capital that could look outwards towards Asia. Thebes was too far away, too insulated, too dominated by the powerful priesthood of Amun. Ramesses needed his own city, a new center of gravity for his empire. He found the perfect location. In the eastern delta, a place with deep roots for his family. It was here, at a site now called Cantir, that he decided to build his new capital. This was not just a city. It was the largest and most ambitious urban project of the new kingdom. Ramesses poured the immense wealth of the empire, flush with gold from Nubian mines and tribute from vassal states, into its construction. He called it Pi-Ramesses. Let us try to conjure its image at its height. Around 1250 B.C., this was no sleepy town on the Nile. Pi-Ramesses was a sprawling, vibrant, cosmopolitan center of imperial power, covering an estimated 18 square kilometers, making it one of the largest cities in the ancient world. Its heart was a massive, magnificent temple to the state god Amun-Ra, but this was a city that reflected the empire's international character. The city was divided into 4 great districts, each with its own patron deity and temple complex. The western district was dedicated to Amun, the southern to the creator god Ptah, the eastern to the ancient sun god Atum, and, most tellingly, the northern district was dedicated to Astarte, a Semitic goddess of war and fertility, whose worship was imported from Syria. This was a clear signal. This city was the bridge between Egypt and Asia, a place where cultures and gods met under the watchful eye of the pharaoh. A great branch of the Nile, the Pelusiac branch, flowed directly through the city, creating a bustling harbor filled with ships. Here, trading vessels from Cyprus, Crete, and the Levantan coast would dock alongside the pharaoh's mighty warships. The river fed a network of canals that crisscrossed the city, creating islands and districts, connected by bridges, earning it the nickname the City of Waters. On these islands stood the city's most important structures. The grandest, of course, was the pharaoh's own residential palace. Excavations have revealed it to be an enormous complex, its walls and floors decorated with stunning painted tiles, depicting swirling floral patterns, captive foreign animals, and scenes of Egyptian triumph. One can imagine foreign ambassadors walking down these corridors, their minds reeling at the sheer wealth and power on display. But Pi-Ramesses was, above all, a military city. It was the headquarters of the entire Egyptian army. It contained the largest chariot stables and workshops ever discovered in Egypt, capable of housing and maintaining nearly 500 of the pharaoh's elite chariot squadrons. Vast barracks housed thousands of soldiers, many of whom were foreign mercenaries, Shurden, Libyans, and Nubians, who formed a key part of Ramesses's fighting force. Workshops hummed with activity, forging bronze shields, swords, and spear points on an industrial scale. This was the engine room of the Egyptian war machine. From here, Ramesses launched his campaigns into Syria. From here, he controlled his vast and sometimes restless empire. For over a century and a half, Pi-Ramesses was the glittering jewel of the north. Its reputation was legendary. In ancient poems, it is described as a place of beauty and abundance. Full of provisions and food, its ponds are filled with fish, its fields are filled with fowl, a paradise on earth. It is this legendary city of Ramesses that is almost certainly the Ramses mentioned in the Old Testament's book of Exodus, the treasure city that the enslaved Hebrews were forced to build for the pharaoh. While there is no direct archaeological evidence for this specific event, the biblical memory preserves the fame and importance of this great city, a place of monumental construction on an unprecedented scale. So, what happened? How could a city this large, this important, this legendary, simply disappear? It was not sacked by a foreign army. It was not destroyed by an earthquake. The agent of its destruction was silent, slow, and utterly unstoppable. It was the Nile itself. The Nile Delta is not a static landscape. It is a living, breathing system, a constant struggle between the river depositing silt and the sea eroding the coast. The very branches of the river are not fixed. Over centuries they can meander, change course, and most catastrophically, they can silt up. Pi-Ramesses was built on the Pelusiac branch of the Nile, which in the 13th century BC was the main eastern artery of the river. All of the city's life depended on it. It provided the water for the canals and the harbor. It irrigated the vast agricultural lands that produced the provisions and food of the celebratory poems. It was the highway for trade and communication. Sometime during the 20th dynasty, about a century after Ramesses's death, the slow death of the Pelusiac branch began. For reasons of geology and hydrology, we are still trying to fully understand. The flow of water began to shift westward towards another branch, which would later be known as the Tanitic branch. The process would have been imperceptible at first, a slightly lower flood than the year before, the harbor needing to be dredged a little more frequently. But over decades, the trend would have been undeniable and terrifying. The great river was leaving them. Imagine the slow-motion collapse. The bustling harbor, once capable of hosting entire fleets, became a shallow, muddy basin, unusable for large ships. The lifeblood of international trade was severed. The smaller canals that crisscrossed the city began to dry up, turning into stagnant, mosquito-infested ditches. The water table dropped. The fields surrounding the city, once so famously fertile, began to wither, their irrigation channels now filled with dust. The city of waters was becoming a city of sand. Its very foundation was being pulled out from under it. A city of hundreds of thousands of people cannot survive without water. Pi-Ramesses, the great symbol of Ramesside power, was becoming uninhabitable. By the time the 21st dynasty came to power around 1070 BC, The city was a ghost of its former self, a skeleton of monumental grandeur stranded in an increasingly arid landscape. It was then, as we learned in our last chapter, that the kings of Tanis made their audacious decision. They saw Pi-Ramesses not as a dying city to be mourned, but as a divine quarry to be harvested. The great deconstruction began. This was not a chaotic looting. It was a careful, state-organized relocation. The obelisks were lowered. The colossi were levered from their pedestals. The sphinx were dug up, and the temple walls were disassembled block by block. Every piece of monumental stone, the very skin and bones of the city's identity, was moved 30 kilometers away to build Tanis. What was left behind at Pi-Ramesses? Everything that couldn't be moved or wasn't worth moving. They left the mud brick foundations of the palaces and houses. They left the clay floors of the chariot workshops. They left millions of pottery sherds and the humble remnants of daily life. They took the monumental skin and left the mud brick skeleton behind. And so, Pi-Ramesses vanished from history's view. When later Greek geographers came to the area, there was nothing to see but fields. The location was forgotten. All that remained was the name, and the glorious reflection of its monuments standing in the new city of Tanis. This is why, for so long, archaeologists believed that Tanis was Pi-Ramesses. The illusion was perfect. The truth was only uncovered through modern science. In the 1960s, the Austrian archaeologist Manfred Bietak began work at the site of Cantia. Instead of digging, randomly he employed geophysical survey techniques, particularly magnetometry. A magnetometer allows archaeologists to detect subtle variations in the Earth's magnetic field, revealing the presence of buried structures like mud brick walls or fire pits without ever breaking ground. What his surveys revealed was staggering. Underneath the quiet farm fields of Cantia, he found the ghostly outline of a massive, planned city. He found the ground plan of the huge temple, the sprawling palace complex, the grid of the barracks, and the sweeping curve of the chariot training grounds. It was the blueprint of a ghost city. The scale and layout matched the ancient descriptions of Pi-Ramesses perfectly. When he began to excavate, he found the things the kings of Tanis had left behind. The foundations, the industrial waste from the bronze workshops, and the decorated plaster floors of the palace. The mystery was solved. Cantia was the true Pi-Ramesses. The story of Pi-Ramesses is a profound lesson in the relationship between a civilization and its environment. It shows that even the most powerful ruler on earth, a man who called himself a god and built for eternity, was ultimately at the mercy of the river. His magnificent capital, the heart of his empire, was built on a foundation that was literally shifting beneath his feet. Its disappearance was not an act of war, but an act of ecology. It is a story that reminds us that the grandest human designs can be undone not by a bang, but by a slow, silent, inexorable change in the world around, them leaving behind nothing but a name, a legend, and an empty footprint in the mud. Our journey has been one of peeling back layers. We have seen how the truth of Tanis was hidden beneath a veneer of borrowed glory, and how the physical reality of Pi-Ramesses was buried under quiet farm fields. We have uncovered a story of monumental theft and geological destiny. But what if the story runs deeper still? What if the great city of Ramesses II, the source of Tanis's splendor, was itself built upon a ghost? What if the very ground on which it stood was already haunted by the memory of another lost capital from an even more turbulent time? This is our final destination. Not a new location, but a deeper level of the same patch of earth, a story beneath. The story. We are looking for the lost city of Var, Eisdot, when the Austrian archaeologist Manfred Bietak and his team began their groundbreaking excavations at Contair, proving it to be the true location of Pi-Ramesses. They soon realized they were digging through more than one city. As they excavated below the foundations of Ramesses' palaces and barracks, below the floors of his chariot workshops, they began to find something else. The pottery style changed dramatically. The architecture of the houses was different. The burial customs were utterly foreign to Egyptian tradition. They were unearthing an older, distinctly non-Egyptian city lying directly beneath Pi-Ramesses. They had found the lost capital of Egypt's most hated invaders, the city of Avaris, seat of the mysterious Hyksos kings. To understand Avaris, we must cast our minds back to the Second Intermediate Period, a time of chaos and division that preceded the glorious New Kingdom. Around 1780 BC, the centralized power of the Egyptian state had once again collapsed. Into this power vacuum came waves of immigrants from the northeast, from Syria and Palestine. These people, known to the Egyptians as the Hakakasit, or rulers of foreign lands, a term that became corrupted into Hyksos, were culturally and technologically distinct. They brought with them new forms of bronze working, new styles of pottery, and, most decisively, the horse-drawn chariot, a weapon of war that was new to Egypt. For a time, they settled peacefully in the eastern Nile Delta, but eventually, their leaders grew powerful enough to seize control of northern Egypt. They established their own dynasty of pharaohs, ruling from a capital city they built up at a place called Avaris. For over 100 years, Egypt was split, with these foreign Hyksos kings ruling the north from Avaris, and the native Egyptian pharaohs relegated to a rump state in the south, at Thebes, to later nationalistic Egyptian scribes of the New Kingdom. This was a period of profound humiliation, a time when their sacred land was governed by outsiders. The Hyksos were remembered as brutal conquerors, even though the archaeological evidence suggests a more complex story of cultural fusion and exchanged at the city of Avaris, uncovered by Bietak's team, gives us a fascinating glimpse into this unique period. It was a thriving port city, strategically located on the same branch of the Nile that would later serve Pi-Ramesses. It was a major center for trade with the eastern Mediterranean. Excavations have revealed a bustling harbor and artifacts from Cyprus, Crete, and the Levant, but the city's character was profoundly different from an Egyptian one. Instead of sprawling open Egyptian-style temples, the Hyksos built smaller temples in Assyrian style. The houses were different, and most strikingly, people were buried within the settlement, sometimes right next to their houses, a practice anathema to Egyptian custom. They were buried with their weapons, and in some startling cases, high-ranking warriors were buried with their donkeys, an animal associated with caravans and their Asiatic homeland. For over a century, Avaris was the capital of a foreign-ruled Egypt, but the simmering resentment of the Theban pharaohs in the south eventually boiled over into a full-scale war of liberation. The final battles were led by Pharaoh Amos I, who, in a series of brilliant campaigns, pushed the Hyksos forces back, besieged Avaris, and finally captured the city, driving the foreigners out of Egypt for good. This event around 1550 BC is considered the foundational moment of the New Kingdom, the dawn of Egypt's greatest age of empire. The city of Avaris was sacked and largely abandoned. Its name became synonymous with a shameful past that was best forgotten, and so the land fell silent for a time. The ruins of the Hyksos capital lay moldering in the delta mud for several generations. And then came Ramesses the Great. When he chose the location for his new, magnificent northern capital, he chose this exact spot. This was no accident. The strategic advantages were still there, the access to the Nile branch, the gateway to Asia, but the symbolic power of the location was immense. By building Pi-Ramesses directly on top of the ruins of Avaris, Ramesses was making a monumental statement of power and vengeance. He was burying the memory of the hated foreign invaders under the foundations of his new, purely Egyptian imperial city. It was the ultimate act of historical and cultural erasure. The greatest city of the new kingdom was built, quite literally, on the grave of Egypt's former occupiers. Now, at last, we can see the full, breathtaking cycle of history condensed into this one small piece of the Nile Delta. First, the foreign city of Avaris rises, thrives, and is violently destroyed. Then, centuries later, the Egyptian metropolis of Pi-Ramesses is built on its ruins as a symbol of ultimate victory and dominance. Then, Pi-Ramesses itself, the city of the great conqueror, is conquered not by an army, but by the silent, shifting course of the river, and is slowly abandoned. And finally, the monumental skin of Pi-Ramesses is carefully peeled away and moved to create Tanis, a borrowed city that projects a power its kings did not truly have. Avaris, Pi-Ramesses, Tanis, one story, 3 acts, played out over 1,000 years on the same stage of earth and water. This is the ultimate lesson of Egypt's lost cities. They are not isolated stories of decline and fall. They are interconnected, one growing from the ashes of another, one borrowing the stones of its predecessor, one burying the memory of its enemy. From the ideological purity of Amarna to the mercantile wealth of Thonis-Heracleion to the great layered illusion of the Delta capitals, we see a civilization in constant dialogue with itself and its environment. We see how faith can build a city from nothing, how nature can swallow it whole, and how the need for political legitimacy can lead men to move mountains, or at least to move obelisk. The ground beneath our feet is never truly empty. It is a palimpsest, a scroll on which stories are written, erased, and written over again. And the lost cities of Egypt are perhaps the grandest evidence of this truth. Their untold stories are not just tales of sand and ruin, but of the endless, cyclical human drama of power, belief, memory, and forgetting. Every story has a beginning, a moment when the first seeds are sown. In our journey through Egypt's lost cities, we have navigated the complexities of empire at its height and in its decline. We have seen cities lost to faith, to nature, and to political ambition. But now we must travel deeper into the past, beyond the age of the pyramids, before the first pharaoh ever wore the double crown of a unified kingdom. We are searching for the very first ghosts, the prototypes of the Egyptian city and the sacred Necropolis. These are the places where the foundational ideas of Egyptian civilization were forged and whose own decline set a pattern that would echo for 3,000 years. Our destination is the deep south, to the predynastic world of Nekhen and Abydos. Long before Memphis, Thebes, or Pi-Ramesses there was Nekhen. To the Greeks it was known as Heretic, the city of the falcon, and the name is deeply significant. For it was here, on the west bank of the Nile in Upper Egypt, that the falcon god Horus, the divine embodiment of kingship, found his first and most important earthly home. Around 3800 BC, while much of the Nile Valley was still a patchwork of small agricultural villages, Nekhen exploded into something new, something unprecedented. It became arguably Egypt's first true city. At its height, Nekhen was a sprawling, bustling metropolis, home to perhaps 10,000 people, a staggering number for the time. It was a center of industry, wealth, and power. Archaeologists have unearthed the remnants of a massive brewery, the oldest and largest ever found in the world, capable of producing hundreds of gallons of beer per day. This was not for simple evening refreshment. This was industrial-scale production, used to pay a vast workforce, to fund the elite, and to fuel the grand religious festivals that were central to the city's life. Beer in ancient Egypt was currency, and Nekhen was the national mint. The city's layout was complex. There was a dense urban core of mud brick houses, workshops for potters and stone workers, and enclosures for cattle, a primary measure of wealth. But separated from the living quarters was a precinct that marks the true beginning of our story. It was a sacred center, a ceremonial complex dedicated to the falcon god Horus. Here we find no towering stone temples like those of the later pharaohs. The architecture was of wood, reeds, and mud. Yet what took place here laid the groundwork for all of Egyptian religion to come. Excavations have unearthed vast quantities of animal bones, crocodiles, hippos, and wild cattle, suggesting elaborate rituals and sacrifices made to appease the wild forces of nature, to bring order out of chaos. It is in the cemetery of Nekhen's elite, known as HK6, that we find the most haunting and significant discoveries. Here, archaeologists found the earliest evidence of a ruling class expressing its power through elaborate burials. Tombs were carved deep into the ground, lined with mud brick and filled with exquisite pottery, finely carved stone objects, and ivory. But they also contained something more profound. One tomb, labeled Tomb 11, held the remains of several baboons and a wildcat, clearly cared for and buried with reverence. Another, larger complex contained the graves of elephants, hippos, and wild cattle. This was not a random collection of animals. This was Egypt's first royal zoo, a menagerie of power. The ability to capture, control, and command the most powerful and exotic creatures of the natural world was a direct statement of the ruler's own supernatural might. It was a precursor to the pharaoh's role as the master of both the civilized and the wild. And it is from Nekhen that we get our first true glimpse of history, our first image of a king, the famous Narmer palette, a ceremonial stone slab that many scholars believe depicts the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, was discovered not in a tomb, but in a cache of sacred objects buried within the temple precinct at Nekhen. On it, we see a king, Narmer, wearing the crowns of both lands, smiting his enemies, his actions overseen by the ever-present falcon god Horus. This single object, one of the most important artifacts ever found in Egypt, tells us that Nekhen was the political and ideological heartland from which the unification of Egypt was launched. It was the cradle of the pharaohs. But what happened to this great proto-city? Why is it now a lost city, a landscape of low, crumbling mounds in the desert? Nekhen's decline is a story that would become familiar to the builders of Pi-Ramesses. Thousands of years later, it was a victim of environmental change. During its heyday, the climate in the region was wetter. The vast desert plains, the wadis behind the city, were semi-arid grasslands capable of supporting herds of cattle and wildlife. But as the climate of North Africa shifted and became more arid, the desert encroached. The grasslands disappeared, stressing the city's economic base. The Nile itself may have shifted its course slightly, moving away from the city's center. Power, too, began to shift. As the newly unified kingdom consolidated its power, the political center of gravity moved north, closer to the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt. First to Abydos, and then to Memphis. Nekhen, the once mighty city of the Falcon, slowly faded. Its population dwindled, its industries fell silent, and its mud brick walls crumbled back into the earth from which they were made. It became a ghost of the past, respected as an ancestral home of the kings, but no longer a center of power. It became Egypt's first lost capital. From the city of the living king, we travel a short distance north to the city of the dead kings, Abydos. If Nekhen was the cradle of the pharaoh's power in life, Abydos was the cradle of their power in death. It is here that the very concept of the royal cemetery, the blueprint for the Valley of the Kings, was born. On a high desert plateau called el-Kab, meaning mother of pots, for the millions of pottery shards that litter its surface, the first kings of a unified Egypt chose to build their eternal homes. The tombs of these first dynasty kings are unlike anything that came before. They are complex subterranean structures with central burial chambers for the king, surrounded by dozens of smaller subsidiary graves. And here we find a practice that is both fascinating and chilling, a practice that was abandoned almost as soon as it began. The occupants of these smaller graves were not dogs or elephants. They were human. Young men, women, and artisans were sacrificed and buried alongside their king, meant to serve him in the afterlife. One tomb, that of the pharaoh Deir, had over 300 of these subsidiary graves surrounding it. This was the ultimate expression of a king's power, the belief that his personal influence extended so far that his entire court would follow him into the next world. It is a stark, brutal practice that tells us just how absolute the authority of these first god-kings was. Alongside these tombs, back on the edge of the cultivated land, the kings built another structure, massive, mud brick rectangular enclosures with high niched walls. These were not tombs. They were funeral palaces, places where the cult of the dead king could be celebrated for eternity. They were the forerunners of the later mortuary temples that would dot the Theon landscape. The largest and best preserved of these, the Shunet el-Zebi, still stands today, its imposing mud brick walls a haunting silhouette against the desert sky, the oldest surviving freestanding mud brick, building of its size in the world. But Abydos' importance did not end with the first dynasty. It underwent a transformation. It became inextricably linked with the god who would come to dominate the Egyptian afterlife, Osiris. It was believed that the tomb of the first dynasty king Deir was in fact the tomb of Osiris himself. Abydos became the most sacred pilgrimage site in all of Egypt. For thousands of years, Egyptians of all classes yearned to make a journey to Abydos at least once in their lives, or if they couldn't, to have a stela, a memorial stone, erected there in their name. This would link their soul to the eternal cycle of resurrection embodied by Osiris, guaranteeing them a place in the afterlife. The entire landscape became a vast city of the dead, a sprawling necropolis covered in the memorials of millions of hopeful souls. Yet, despite its immense religious importance, Abydos as a residential city never achieved the prominence of Thebes or Memphis. Its power was sacred, not political. It was a place of ghosts and memory. The great enclosures of the first kings fell into disuse, their purpose forgotten, their mud brick walls slowly eroded by the wind. El-Kab became a sacred, untouchable wasteland, visited only by pilgrims and priests. The memory of the sacrificed retainers was buried, the practice never to be repeated, an early, brutal chapter in the story of kingship that was quietly closed. The stories of Nekhen and Abydos are the prequel to everything we have discussed. The industrial-scale production at Nekhen prefigures the vast resources needed to supply a city like Pi-Ramesses. The abandonment of Nekhen due to environmental change is a prelude to the fate of that same great northern capital. The ideological fervor of Nekhen's Horus cult provides a context for the revolutionary Aten worship at Amarna. The sacred landscape of Abydos, built for the dead, establishes a tradition that would culminate in the Valley of the Kings and the Workers' Village of Deir el-Medina. These first ghosts teach us that the cycle of rise and fall is as old as Egyptian civilization itself. They show us that long before the grand stone cities were ever conceived, their fates were being rehearsed in mud brick and sand. They are the foundational layer, the original lost cities, upon which all others were built, a silent testament to the fact that in the land of the pharaohs the past is never truly dead. It is merely waiting, buried just beneath the surface. We have spent our journey so far walking the fertile banks of the Nile, the great green artery that gives Egypt its life. We have seen cities rise and fall according to its whims, but the lifeblood of the empire, the literal gold in its veins, and the brilliant color on its sacred objects, was not drawn from the black soil of the riverbank. It was won from the searing, desolate wilderness that stretched out on either side, the vast and hostile deserts. To truly understand the wealth that built the temples of Thebes and the splendor that filled the tombs of Tanis, we must leave the Nile behind. We must travel to the forgotten outposts, the ephemeral cities of dust and rock, the places that were not homes, but engines. These are the lost settlements of the miners, quarrymen, and soldiers who toiled on the burning edge of the world, to fuel the glory of the pharaohs. Our first destination takes us east, across the Red Sea Gulf, into the jagged, sun-blasted mountains of the Sinai Peninsula. This is a land of profound silence and brutal heat, a place that seems antithetical to life. Yet for thousands of years, Egyptian expeditions marched into this wilderness with a single purpose. They were searching for Mefkat, the brilliant blue-green stone we call turquoise. To the ancient Egyptians, this was not merely a gemstone. It was a piece of the sky fallen to earth, a symbol of joy, rebirth, and divine protection. It was the color of the great goddess Hathor, the Lady of Turquoise. And so, to this forbidding landscape, they came to dig dot at a place called Sarabat el-Kadim. High on a barren plateau, they established not a city, but a unique and enduring outpost. For centuries during the Middle and New Kingdoms, expeditions would arrive, set up camp, and begin the back-breaking work of mining. Life here was incredibly hard. The miners were a mix of skilled Egyptian craftsmen, prisoners of war, and local Semitic-speaking tribesmen pressed into service. They lived in simple stone huts, endured scorching days and freezing nights, and relied on long, vulnerable supply lines for food and water. This was not a place of comfort. It was a place of toil and prayer. The heart of the settlement was not a palace or a fort, but a strange and rambling temple dedicated to Hathor. It was unlike the symmetrical stone temples of the Nile Valley. It began as a simple rock-hewn shrine, a grotto dedicated to the goddess of the mountain. Over hundreds of years, successive expeditions added to it. Kings would erect steely carved stone slabs to commemorate their successful missions, leaving a forest of inscribed stones that recorded the history of the site. The temple grew organically, a chaotic accretion of chapels, halls, and courtyards, a testament to centuries of hope and hardship in the desert. But it is here, amidst the dust and the turquoise chips, that we find one of the most profound untold stories in human history, a discovery far more valuable than any gemstone. Among the official, beautiful hieroglyphic inscriptions left by the Egyptian scribes, archaeologists found other, cruder carvings. They were scratched onto rocks in the walls of the mines. The symbols were clearly inspired by Egyptian hieroglyphs. The sign for water, the sign for a house, the head of an ox, but they weren't used to write the Egyptian language. They were being used phonetically to represent the sounds of a completely different Semitic language spoken by the local miners. What we are looking at is the birth of an idea, the invention of the alphabet. These foreign workmen, seeing the complex but powerful system of hieroglyphs, adapted a handful of its symbols to write down the sounds of their own tongue. The Egyptian hieroglyph for an ox, Aleph, became the sign for the A sound. The sign for a house, Bet, became the B sound. Aleph Bet, alphabet. This humble collection of scratchings on a desert rock at Sarabat el-Kadim is the distant ancestor of nearly every alphabet used in the world today, including the one you are reading now. It was not invented in a grand library or a royal court. It was born of necessity by common laborers in a remote mining camp, struggling to find a voice in a world dominated by a foreign tongue. When the mines were eventually exhausted and Sarabat el-Kadim was abandoned, this idea was not lost. It was carried back to the Levant, where it would evolve into Phoenician, then Greek, then Latin, conquering the world more completely than any pharaoh's army. The story was similar in the vast eastern desert between the Nile and the Red Sea. This was the source of much of Egypt's gold and the location of its most famous quarries for monumental stone, like the grey whack of the Wadi Hammamat. The routes to these sites were perilous, dotted with rudimentary wells and protected by small military garrisons housed in lonely forts. These were not cities. They were threads in a vast logistical network. We find the ghostly remains of their camps, the outlines of their huts, and the poignant graffiti they left on the rocks: a name, a prayer, a record of the flood level, a lonely hello from across the millennia. Now we turn west, into the endless expanse of the great sand sea. Here, we find a different kind of desert outpost, the Oases. These were not just isolated watering holes. They were substantial islands of life in a sea of death, crucial hubs on long-distance trade routes that brought ivory and exotic goods from the heart of Africa. The largest of these, the Karga Oasis, was fortified and developed into a string of agricultural settlements, a vital part of the empire's breadbasket. It was also a place of punishment, a remote location to which political dissidents and disgraced officials were exiled, a sort of Egyptian Siberia, further north and far more remote is the legendary oasis of Siwa. For most of its history, Siwa was culturally distinct, speaking its own Berber language. But during the late period, its temple, dedicated to a local form of the god Amun, became famous throughout the Mediterranean world for its infallible oracle. The oracle of Amun at Siwa was considered one of the great prophetic voices of the age. Its fame became so great that in 331 BC, after conquering Egypt, the young Alexander the Great embarked on a perilous 8-day journey across the open desert to consult it. The details of his visit are shrouded in legend, but ancient sources claim the priests hailed him as the son of Amun, confirming his divine status and legitimizing his rule over Egypt. This single event placed this incredibly remote outpost at the very center of world history for a fleeting moment. So what makes these places lost? Their existence was fragile, utterly dependent on the stability of the central state. When the mines at Serabat el-Qadim were no longer profitable, the expeditions stopped coming, and the site was left to the wind and the spirits. When trade routes shifted, the lonely forts along the desert roads were no longer supplied, their garrisons withdrawn, their walls slowly covered by the drifting sand. When the Roman Empire declined, its control over the oases weakened, and they faded back into regional obscurity. These places were lost not to a single cataclysm, but to the slow decay of purpose. They were the forgotten wiring of the empire. When the central lights of the kingdom dimmed, these remote bulbs went out, one by one. The story of the desert outposts is a necessary corrective to our Nile-centric view of Egypt. It reminds us that the glittering civilization of the pharaohs was not self-sufficient. It was built on the backs of forgotten people in forgotten places, who endured incredible hardship to extract the raw materials of empire. Their settlements were never meant to be eternal. They were temporary, functional, and ultimately disposable. And yet, in the case of Serabat el-Qadim, one of these harsh and lonely outposts gave birth to an idea that would outlive all the pyramids, a ghost more enduring than any stone temple. An empire is defined not just by its vibrant center, but by its hardened edges. A border is more than a line on a map. It is a declaration, a physical statement of power that says, "Here our world begins, and here we will hold it." For ancient Egypt, the most critical, most contested, and most heavily fortified border was its southern frontier with Nubia. The relationship was complex, a source of deep-seated fear, but also the origin of Egypt's greatest wealth, gold. 2. Control this land and its resources. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom, around 1860 BC, undertook one of the most ambitious and brutal military construction projects in the ancient world. They built a chain of fortresses so immense and formidable that they beggar belief. And their story ends not in ancient ruins, but in a watery grave created in our own time, a modern parallel to the fate of Yon is Herakleion, the land of Nubia. In what is now northern Sudan was the conduit for the riches of Africa, but it was also home to powerful organized kingdoms that posed a constant threat to Egypt's southern flank. Pharaohs like Senusret III were not content to launch periodic raids. They sought total domination. Their solution was to build a series of 17 massive mud brick fortresses along a treacherous stretch of the Nile, known as the Second Cataract, a region of rapids and rocky outcrops that formed a natural defensive barrier. These were not simple forts. They were colossal engines of war, each a masterpiece of military design, and the greatest and most studied of them all was the fortress of Buhen. To look upon the original plans of Buhen is to see the mind of a military genius at work. It was constructed on the west bank of the Nile, a sprawling complex covering over 13,000 square meters. Its inner citadel was protected by a gigantic wall, 5 meters thick and 10 meters high, punctuated by projecting square towers. At its base was a paved rampart, a stone-lined defensive ditch over 8 meters wide and nearly 7 meters deep, and beyond that another outer wall with round bastions, each studded with triple loopholes. These loopholes were splayed at different angles, allowing archers to create a devastating, overlapping field of fire, a killing zone from which no attacker could approach the main wall unscathed. This was not a defensive wall. It was an offensive weapon. Inside these impenetrable defenses was not a simple barracks, but a fully functioning city, a microcosm of Egypt itself transplanted into hostile territory. There was a grid of paved streets, a commander's palace that was essentially a mini-governor's mansion, barracks for thousands of soldiers, granaries to store years' worth of supplies, and workshops for repairing weapons and chariots. At its heart, as in every Egyptian town, stood a temple dedicated to the state gods, a declaration that this land, too, now belonged to Horus. Buhen and its sister forts were self-sufficient citadels, capable of withstanding years of siege and projecting Egyptian power deep into Nubia. They were the physical manifestation of an iron fist. For centuries, these fortresses served their purpose. They were the anchors of Egyptian colonial rule, the centers for administering the conquered territory, and the secure depots through which the river of Nubian gold flowed north to the pharaoh's treasury. They were a visible, terrifying symbol of the empire's reach and its resolve. Even after the Middle Kingdom collapsed and the fortresses were temporarily overrun by the Nubian kingdom of Kush, they were reclaimed and re-garrisoned by the pharaohs of the new kingdom, who recognized their timeless strategic importance. They stood for nearly 4,000 years, their mud brick walls baking and eroding under the Nubian sun, the most enduring monuments to Egypt's imperial ambition. And then came the 20th century dot in the 1960s, the modern Egyptian government, under Gamal Abdel Nasser, undertook a project to rival the building of the pyramids, the construction of the Aswan High Dam. The dam was designed to control the Nile's annual flood, revolutionize agriculture, and generate immense amounts of electricity. It was a symbol of a new, modern Egypt, but it came at a terrible cost. The dam would create one of the largest man-made lakes in the world, Lake Nasser, and this new lake would inundate hundreds of kilometers of the Nile Valley in southern Egypt and northern Sudan. It would drown the entire historical land of Nubia, submerging thousands of years of history and displacing tens of thousands of people. What followed was one of the most remarkable and poignant archaeological efforts in history. UNESCO launched a massive international campaign to save the monuments of Nubia. The world watched as the great rock-cut temples of Abu Simbel were meticulously sawn into blocks weighing dozens of tons and reassembled on higher ground. Dozens of other stone temples were similarly moved. But the great fortresses of the Middle Kingdom, from Buhen to Semna to Uranardi, faced a different fate. They were built almost entirely of millions of mud bricks. There was no way to move them. They were simply too vast, too complex, and too fragile. They were doomed. For archaeologists, it became a frantic race against time. Teams from around the world descended on the sites, excavating, documenting, mapping, and recording everything they could before the waters came. They peeled back the layers of Buhen's history, revealing its life as a city, the layout of its streets, the contents of its workshops, the prayers in its temple. They walked the ramparts where ancient sentries had once stood watch, and mapped the defenses that had held an empire's border. And then they could do no more. The process of inundation was slow, silent, and heartbreaking. The rising waters of Lake Nasser, the new tame Nile, began to creep up the banks. They filled the deep, defensive ditch. They lapped at the bases of the mighty walls. They flowed through the gateways and into the city's empty streets. Over the course of months, the fortress of Buhen, which had withstood the armies of Kush and the passage of 4 millennia, slowly dissolved. Its mud brick walls, which had baked hard in the desert sun for centuries, softened, crumbled, and collapsed into the murky depths. The great symbol of Egyptian power on the southern frontier vanished from sight. Its location now marked only by a blank expanse of water on a modern map. The loss of the Nubian fortresses is a profound and unsettling story. Unlike our other lost cities, their destruction was not an act of ancient history, but a deliberate choice of the modern world. They were sacrificed for progress. Their immense historical value weighed against the promise of hydroelectric power and perennial irrigation. Their fate is a powerful reminder that history is not just something we uncover, but something we can also erase. These sunken fortresses are now the ghosts of Lake Nasser, their mighty walls sleeping in the Silt, a submerged legacy of empire and a somber modern echo of the fate of Thonis-Heracleion, a whole city lost beneath the waves. We have stood in awe before the treasures of forgotten kings and walked the ghostly ramparts of drowned forts. We have marveled at the grand ambitions of heretic pharaohs and the vast scale of their monuments. But these creations did not spring fully formed from the divine will of a king. they were made. They were cut, carved, and painted by human hands. This brings us to a fundamental question. Who were the people who actually built eternity for the pharaohs? For centuries, the common Egyptian has been a voiceless figure in the grand narrative of history. But in a secluded valley nestled in the Theban hills lies a lost city that gives them a voice. It is a place that allows us to know them not as a faceless workforce, but as individuals with names, families, fears, and frustrations. We are journeying to the village known today as Deir el-Medina, but which its inhabitants called Set Ma'at, the place of truth. During the New Kingdom, the pharaohs ceased building pyramids and chose to hide their eternal resting places in the desolate, rock-strewn valley that would become the Valley of the Kings. This decision created a security challenge of the highest order. The location of the royal tomb and the immense treasures buried within it was the most sensitive state secret. The work required a team of highly specialized and trustworthy artisans, stone cutters, plasterers, scribes, and painters. And these workers, along with their families, had to be completely isolated from the general population to ensure their silence. The solution was to build them their own purpose-built secret village. Set Ma'at was founded around 1500 BC, tucked away in a natural amphitheater in the desert, a deliberate walk away from the Nile and the bustling metropolis of Thebes. A high wall enclosed the entire village, with a single gateway guarded by official sentries. No one entered or left without permission. It was a gilded cage, a community of elite craftsmen living in deliberate sequestration. For nearly 500 years, this village was home to the generations of men who carved and decorated the tombs of Tutankhamun, Seti I, and Ramesses the Great, and because of its isolation and the bone-dry climate, something miraculous was preserved. The village's trash heaps. The villagers did not have access to large amounts of expensive papyrus for their daily notes. Instead, they wrote on what was freely available, flakes of limestone and broken pieces of pottery. We call these ostraka, and the inhabitants of Deir el-Medina produced tens of thousands of them. These are not grand historical texts. They are the mundane, intimate, and utterly fascinating scraps of daily life. They are shopping lists, work rosters, personal letters, copies of favorite poems, and records of legal disputes. They give us a picture of life in an ancient Egyptian community that is unparalleled in its detail and humanity. We can finally pull back the curtain of history and meet the people. We meet a foreman named Panab, a talented but troublesome figure who is accused in a formal complaint of stealing tools, intimidating co-workers, and harassing the wives of his peers. We read the frantic notes of a woman named Nekhen, who, feeling her time is near, carefully draws up a will to ensure her property is divided fairly among her children. We can read the attendance records from the gang of tomb workers. A scribe named Amenacht diligently notes down who is absent from work and why, brewing beer, suffering from his eye, mummifying his brother, or, most commonly, with his wife. We see their economic lives with stunning clarity. We know they were not slaves, nor were they the suffering laborers we met at Amarna. They were respected state employees, paid a handsome salary in bread, beer, fish, vegetables, and other provisions, delivered by the state, but the state did not always deliver. And here, in the records of Deir el-Medina, we find one of the most remarkable stories in ancient history. During the reign of Ramesses III, the Egyptian empire, beset by foreign invasions and internal corruption, was beginning to falter. The complex bureaucracy that supplied the village began to break down. The grain shipments, the workers' salaries, fell into arrears. They were late by days, then weeks. The place of truth was hungry. What happened next is documented on a papyrus scroll now in Turin. The workers did something unthinkable. They put down their tools and walked off the job. They marched out of their village and towards the grand mortuary temples on the Niles. Back, the very institutions that were supposed to be paying them. They staged a sit-in, a protest, chanting a simple, powerful phrase that echoes across 3,000 years. We are hungry. It was the first recorded labor strike in human history. The panicked officials tried to placate them, offering pastries and promises. But the workers held firm, returning to strike again and again until the overdue grain was finally delivered. It is a moment that utterly shatters the stereotype of a passive population ruled by god kings. It shows us real people with a strong sense of their own rights and worth, standing up to the power of the state to demand what they were owed. These artisans poured their incredible skills not just into the tombs of kings, but into their own eternal resting places. The tombs of the workers of Deir el-Medina, dug into the hillside above their village, are masterpieces of art. Freed from the rigid formality of royal burials, they painted their tombs with vibrant, lively scenes of their families, their homes, their gardens, and their vision of a joyous afterlife. A man named Sennacherib is shown with his wife, strolling through the bountiful fields of paradise. These tombs are a testament to their deep piety, their skill, and their love of life. So why did this unique and vibrant community become a lost city? Its fate was inextricably tied to the fate of the institution it served. By around 1080 BC, the new kingdom had effectively collapsed. The central government no longer had the power or wealth to commission grand tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The royal burial ground was abandoned, and soon fell prey to organized gangs of tomb robbers. For the people of Deir el-Medina, the work simply dried up. There were no more golden shrines to build, no more sacred texts to paint. Their very reason for being had vanished. The state-sponsored project, which had lasted for half a millennium, was over. The villagers packed their belongings and moved away, integrating back into the general population in nearby Thebes. The village of Set Maat was left empty, its houses slowly filling with sand, its secrets preserved in its ostraka-laden trash heaps, waiting for archaeologists to give its people a voice once more. Deir el-Medina is perhaps the most intimate of all our lost cities. It was not lost to flood or famine, but to the end of an era. Its rediscovery did not reveal a story of kings and battles, but one of family, community, and the struggle for dignity. It is a gift of history, a precious window into the lives of the ordinary Egyptians who, with their own hands, built the eternity of the pharaohs. Our journey through the landscape of memory is nearing its end. We have traveled from the dawn of Egyptian civilization to its imperial zenith, but all ages must pass. Our final destination is a city that represents not just the end of pharaonic Egypt, but the birth of a new cosmopolitan world. It is a city founded by a foreign conqueror, which quickly became the intellectual and cultural capital of the entire Mediterranean. It is a city that deliberately superseded the ancient northern capitals, like Pi-Ramesses and Thonis-Heracleion, only to lose its own glorious heart to the same forces of nature and time. We are searching for the ghost of ancient Alexandria. In 332 BC, the young Macedonian general, Alexander the Great, entered Egypt not as an invader, but as a liberator from Persian rule. He was a man who understood power, and he knew he needed a new capital, one that looked outwards to the sea, connecting his new Egyptian province to his burgeoning Greek empire. He chose a strip of land on the Mediterranean coast, a place with a fine natural harbor, protected from the Nile's silting action. Here, he laid out the plans for a metropolis that would bear his name for all time. Alexandria was not designed like an Egyptian city. It was a masterpiece of Hellenistic urban planning, a grid of wide avenues and perpendicular streets, a rational, modern city for a new age. Under the rule of Alexander's general, Ptolemy, and his descendants, Alexandria grew to become the largest, wealthiest, and most brilliant city of its age. It was a true melting pot, a place where Egyptian priests, Greek philosophers, Jewish scholars, Roman administrators, and merchants from across the known world lived and worked side by side. But its fame rested on two legendary landmarks, two wonders that came to define it, both of which are now entirely lost. The first was the pharaohs, the great lighthouse of Alexandria. Standing on an island in the harbor, it was a structure of breathtaking ambition. Rising to a height of over 100 meters, it was one of the tallest man-made structures in the world for centuries. At its apex, a giant mirror reflected sunlight during the day and the light of a great bonfire at night, a beacon visible for dozens of kilometers out to sea, guiding ships safely into the harbor. It was more than a lighthouse. It was a statement of human ingenuity, a symbol of the city's dominance over the sea, a true wonder of the ancient world. For over 1,500 years it stood, a silent witness to the city's changing fortunes, from the rule of the Ptolemies to the Romans and into the Islamic era. But its stone could not stand forever against the tremors of the earth. A series of powerful earthquakes between the 10th and 14th centuries weakened, and then finally toppled the mighty tower, its blocks tumbling into the sea. In a final, poignant echo of the story of Pi-Ramesses, the Mamluk Sultan of the 5th-10th century gathered the remaining stones and reused them to build a fortress on the exact same spot, burying one wonder to create another. The second, and arguably greater, wonder of Alexandria was its great library. This was not a library in the modern sense of a building where one borrows books. It was a research institution, a think tank, the intellectual heart of the ancient world. Founded by Ptolemy I, its mission was staggering in its ambition: to collect a copy of every single scroll ever written, from the tragedies of Sophocles to the histories of Babylon and the sacred texts of Egypt. Royal agents were sent across the world to buy or copy texts. Ships docking in Alexandria's harbor were required to be searched, and any scrolls found were confiscated, copied by scribes, and the copies returned to the owners. At its height, the library and its sister institution at the Serapeum may have held over 500,000 papyrus scrolls. It was here that the foundational work of Western science and scholarship was done. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth with astonishing accuracy. Euclid wrote his Elements, the foundational text of geometry. The Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek for the first time. The human body was dissected, the stars were charted, and the rules of grammar were codified. It was humanity's first great attempt to collect and synthesize all of its knowledge. The loss of this library is therefore the greatest intellectual catastrophe in history. But it was not a single dramatic fire as legend would have it. Its decline was a slow, painful process over centuries. It suffered from budget cuts, political purges where scholars were expelled, and several damaging events during Roman civil wars and religious riots. Each event chipped away at the collection, and with it, our knowledge of the ancient world. We have lost countless works of Greek drama, history, and science. The untold stories that vanished with the library's scrolls are incalculable. It is the ghost of this lost knowledge that truly haunts us. And what of the physical city of the Ptolemies and Cleopatra? Where are the palaces, temples, and avenues of the ancient Metropolis? Much of it shares the fate of Thonis-Heracleion. The same geological forces, the slow subsidence of the land and the tremors of earthquakes have caused the ancient coastline to sink. The entire royal quarter of ancient Alexandria, including the palaces of Cleopatra and the administrative heart of her kingdom, now lies beneath the murky waters of the city's eastern harbor. Marine archaeologists today dive among a wonderland of fallen columns, sphinx and paving stones, trying to map the ghost of the sunken city. The rest of the ancient city lies buried directly beneath the modern one. The bustling metropolis of today is built upon its Roman, Greek, and pharaonic past. Every time a new building digs its foundations, glimpses of the old city emerge, only to be documented and covered over again. It is a city living on top of its own ghosts. Alexandria is the final and most fitting destination on our journey. It is the city that superseded all the others, the final capital of an independent Egypt before the Roman conquest. It lost its greatest monument to the same reuse that characterized Tanis. It lost its royal heart to the same sea that claimed Thonis-Heracleion. And it lost its intellectual soul, its library, to the slow, inexorable decay of time and human conflict. It is the closing of a cycle. The story that began in the predynastic dust of Nekhen ends here, in a great cosmopolitan city that looked to a new Hellenistic future, only to become itself another one of Egypt's magnificent lost cities, its untold stories drowned in the sea, or faded into the silence of its vanished library. Our journey is at an end. We have traveled thousands of years in time and thousands of kilometers across the land of Egypt and beyond. We have moved from the first whispers of civilization in the dust of Nekhen to the final drowning shores. Greco-Roman Alexandria. We have walked the sun-scorched streets of a heretic's dream at Amarna and stood on the ghostly ramparts of Buhen as the waters of a new age rose to claim it. Our search for lost cities has shown us that a city can die in 1,000 different ways. It can be dismantled and moved, its identity stolen like Tanis borrowing the soul of Pi-Ramesses. It can be swallowed by the sea and the shifting earth like the great port of Thonis-Heracleion. It can be abandoned when its purpose ends like the secret village of Deir el-Medina, or when its resources are bled dry like the lonely outposts. of the desert, but the thread that connects them all is the profound, humbling realization that nothing is permanent. Not even the works of those who believe themselves to be gods on earth. The will of a pharaoh could raise a city from the sand, but the silent, inexorable will of the Nile could choke it to death. The wealth of an empire could build fortresses of unmatched power, but the needs of a new century could condemn them to a watery grave. History, we find, is a relentless conversation between human ambition and the power of the natural world. And in the long run, nature always has the final word. And yet, these stories teach us that lost does not mean gone forever. An echo always remains, a reused stone in a new temple wall, a sunken sphinx sleeping in the silt, a single ostracon detailing a worker's complaint, a crude scratching on a rock that becomes the ancestor of all our alphabets. The ground beneath our feet is a library of these echoes, a landscape of memory where the stories of Avaris lie directly beneath the story of Pi-Ramesses, a cycle of creation and destruction, forgetting and rediscovery. These lost cities are more than just archaeological curiosities. They are mirrors. They remind us that our own bustling cities, our own monuments of steel and glass, are just as fragile, just as temporary in the grand sweep of time. The forces of nature, of social change, of shifting belief and political will that turned these ancient metropolises into ghosts are still at work today. Thank you for joining me on this long journey through the untold stories of Egypt's lost cities. I hope it has given you a sense of the quiet mysteries that still lie waiting beneath the sand, the sea, and the streets of the modern world. Until next time, may your thoughts be deep and your rest be peaceful. Good night.